everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 0 of Pro Wrestling's Top 50. This is our introduction to Season 3 of the program, and I'm very excited as this will be a countdown of the top 50 matches in ECW history. So my journey with ECW started years and years before I was ever even able to watch footage of it. So I, as a youngster growing up, I was obsessed with wrestling, obviously. I got all of the pro wrestling magazines. It seemed like every single weekend I would pick up a new issue of a magazine at the corner store. And when ECW started to rise to popularity, it's when I really took a keen interest in it. And I think that the wrestlers that drew me to ECW were all of the wrestlers that you would expect. First and foremost, it was Sabu. So I was a big 1, 2, 3 Kid fan. And I remember when he showed up, seeing photos of a match that he had with this guy named Sabu, where he was like all bloodied and busted open, and it was from an NWA show in 1993. And I remember that put Sabu on my radar, and just over those first couple of years I would start to see this man pop up more and more and more. There was the photos in the magazines of the infamous fire match that he and the Sheik did in Japan against Tarzan Goto. That just the photos of that in Pro Wrestling Illustrated just blew my mind at the time. I couldn't believe that something like that would occur in a wrestling ring when I'm, just used to North American, WWF and WCW at the time. So that, again, just blew my mind. And much like, the IWA King of the Death match in 1995, seeing photos from that, it really stuck with me. It was something completely different than what I had ever seen. I was a huge Cactus Jack fan in WCW. So when he left WCW in early '94 and turned up in ECW, again, I was starting to see what he was doing there. And I started to become familiar with names like the Sandman and Tommy Dreamer and Mikey Whipwreck. So there were all of these guys that I'd never seen, but I felt like I knew by keeping up on them through the magazines. And then enter 1995. And that set it over the top, and Raven was such a big part of that because, again, I knew Raven as Scotty Flamingo and as Johnny Polo. So to see this dude do a complete shift in his image and just overall presentation, and seeing, him in the magazines, brawling with Tommy Dreamer, and hearing about all of this stuff with Beulah and reading that, again, it was so weird to me, and I wanted to see ECW so badly just to make sure that even though, I could tell that it was Scotty Flamingo, to make sure that this was actually the same person just because of how different it was. And it was just my love for ECW, despite not seeing it, would continue with guys like New Jack, where I'd read about him diving off of balconies, and I'd look at him and he just looked so cool, and the gangsters were always covered in blood, and again, reading about all of these luchadors coming in from AAA, Rey Mysterio, Psychosis, Juventud Guerrera. I'd read about Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero and all of these guys that would start to turn up in WCW, and it was really awesome because I didn't have the internet. I've talked about this before, I didn't get the internet until really late, right? Until 2002, so I was really behind the times. So these guys would turn up on WCW, and I think for a lot of people that were in the same boat as me, it would be these new incredible wrestlers, and that's what it was. I was finally able to see them, but I had this knowledge of them through the wrestling magazines. So I loved ECW. I remember telling my friends about ECW despite having never seen it. And then I remember a big one was I learned that ECW was coming to pay-per-view. So Barely Legal in April of 1997. Again, the magazines, you'd be a couple months behind. So I found out about Barely Legal, I think like a week or so before it was actually supposed to air on pay-per-view. And, back in that time, you would have to call your local cable provider to order a pay-per-view, right? You couldn't just do it with the click of a button or, watch it online or anything, obviously. So I remember having my parents call the paper, we had Western Coaxial Cable at the time, and they called the cable company, for Viewer's Choice pay-per-view to order ECW Barely Legal, only to find out that we would not be carrying it in Canada. And my heart was broken. I thought this was finally my opportunity to see ECW. I knew that they were doing Sabu versus Taz. Again, I had never seen Taz. At that point, I'd gotten a taste of Sabu through, his couple of appearances he had in 1995, WCW. I got to see him against Mr. JL at Halloween Havoc, and that was about it. So I was so excited to see this, only to realize that it wasn't going to happen. So I'd still keep up with ECW through the magazines. I'd see all of these wrestlers turn up elsewhere. And then finally in 1999, I read about ECW coming to TNN, which was a channel that I got, and I was so happy. I remember counting down the days and weeks until the first, TNN episode. I watched it. I watched ECW on TNN every single week. I was obsessed with it. Even though, that wasn't the glory days of ECW, I'll call it, it was just enough for me. And it was weird because at that time when I finally got that ECW exposure, the Attitude Era was in full swing, right? So all of these things that kind of, really piqued my interest in ECW, back before I could see it, the hardcore aspect, the more mature themes, the blood, everything like that, we were now seeing those elements in the WWF. But it's weird because, even though we would get that, I wasn't a huge Attitude Era fan. Like, I liked Stone Cold, I liked DX, but I was also at that point where I was, the in-ring was something that I was really looking for. I love the cruiserweights in WCW, I hate to say it, I love guys like Benoit and Malenko and everybody like that. I always loved Bret Hart. I'd really shifted from, the Hogan, Warrior, sort of, interest that I had in my youth of the big, stars that, would just cut the promos and, be marketed well. I'd really shifted to the better wrestlers. So throughout the Attitude Era, we had all of this crash television, but the actual in-ring product deteriorated so much that, really didn't sit too well with me. And again, growing up, I always considered myself a little bit more of a WCW fan than WWF. And, even during that period, yes, all of my friends would talk about the Attitude Era, so it was that conversation we would get to have because it felt like everybody was watching pro wrestling. But I would watch WCW, to try to get the actual in-ring because they still had the cruiserweights and they still had those good workers. So ECW was this fun mix of both because I'd get, everything that was kind of going on, in the Attitude Era, the elements that I liked, but I would also get the superior in-ring wrestling, with guys like Lance Storm and Rob Van Dam and Jerry Lynn and Super Crazy and Tajiri and Little Guido and all of these guys. So it was this really great mix. And again, it wasn't the heyday, but it was enough for me. And I remember, so as soon as we got ECW on TNN in the fall of '99, in early 2000, the video game came out, Hardcore Revolution, and I had a really cool kind of indie video store not too, far from me. They were the only place that got Hardcore Revolution in, so I rented it for the PlayStation. I started talking to the guy that worked there. He was also a wrestling fan, also, kind of knew ECW. And at that time, ECW had signed a deal with Pioneer to produce a bunch of VHS and DVDs. And he was able to order me in through whatever, company they used to order in their videos. He was able to get me the commercial releases of Barely Legal, 97, and Anarchy Rules, 99. So I finally got to see Barely Legal. I got to see Anarchy Rules, which, was the first pay-per-view of the TNN era. And I wore those tapes out. I love them so much. I still, hold those pay-per-views very near and dear to my heart. ECW, the end of 2000, you could tell it was on its deathbed. They made no bones about it in the magazines and on the broadcast itself that they were losing their TNN deal. I was very, very lucky that I got to see ECW live before it fell to its deathbed. They ran a show in Mississauga, which is just outside of Toronto. It was the highest attended ECW show of all time. It was the last TNN taping. I got to go to it. Extremely, extremely grateful that I, have that notch on my belt. It was a super fun show, and I look back at it very, very fondly. I've been to the ECW arena. I never got to see an ECW show there, but I've seen several independents there, so I still feel like I got at least a little bit of that ECW experience at the time. So, story you've heard from me before, COVID started, I started working from home, and I started going back and watching, all of this wrestling, either from my childhood or from growing up or in my teenage years, or things that I'd never seen before, just because, at the start of COVID, at least promotions weren't running. So I was working from home, work was kind of dead, I'd have this time to spend on wrestling. And I decided I was going to do something that I had never done before. I was going to go and I was going to watch ECW start to finish, watch all of the TV, all of the pay-per-views, the fan cams, everything that I could. So when I finally got the internet in 2002, after ECW, had died, I got into tape trading very, very quickly, and I started to get in a bunch of ECW to finally see the glory years. But I cherry picked. I didn't get the full runs of Hardcore TV or anything like that. I got, compilations that people had made on like the Raven and, Tommy Dreamer feud and the Raven and Sandman feud and, the best matches in ECW history and all of this stuff. So it was funny because watching these matches on an individualized basis, in the early 2000s, it kind of didn't really hold up great. There's still stuff that I really liked, but a lot of those, big kind of story-driven matches that, I had read about, in magazines and started to read about on the internet that people, really, really held, near and dear to themselves, nostalgically, they really weren't working for me. And I kind of thought like, I guess, we're all kind of over ECW and that's why it died out. But this project that I did was so much fun because watching all of these matches now with the full context of all of the storylines and all of the nuances going into it, it made it such a worthwhile experience. Not everything was great. I'll be, very blunt about that. But so much of it was that, even kind of when I got to the tail end, although it wasn't, those peak 95, 96 years that were by far the best out of watching all of this, it still felt sad to me that, I was kind of again at the end of that ECW run, just like it did, at the end of 2000, started 2001, where I felt sad that this promotion was going away. I got that again in 2020 and 2021, which was, really, really weird that 20 years later it would still have that same effect on me. But basically, I watched everything from the NWA title tournament in the summer of '94 all the way up until the end. And again, I watched so many fan cams. I watched all of the television, all of the pay-per-view. So this really is going to be the definitive list of the top 50 matches in ECW history from someone that can now officially say, I've seen it all. It took me about a year to watch all of this. Obviously, I've watched other wrestling in between, so that stretched it out a little bit. But if you've never experienced ECW, or if you've only seen selective things, or if you watched it all in its original run and you want to go back and just be nostalgic for it, I really recommend it. It's something you have to do at least once in your wrestling fandom. Go from that summer of '94 all the way until the end and just immerse yourself in it and, realize how important ECW was and the impact that it had on pro wrestling. Now, with a lot of this stuff, it, doesn't really hold up well from, political correctness standpoint in the year 2021. That is what you're getting with ECW. Now, I've always tried really hard, throughout the first two seasons of this series that, to give disclaimers if any of the wrestlers had, been brought up in the speaking out movement or had, other behavior that don't align with my personal views. For season 3, I kind of feel like every video would need something along those lines just because of, I hate using the excuse that it was a different time, but, women were not presented well. People of different backgrounds were not presented well. It just, it really doesn't hold up in that way, as a lot of stuff from that era does. So I'm, unless there's anything or anybody really, really bad in there, I'm not going to do that, but just know what you're getting into. If you were planning on watching ECW anyways, I think you would kind of know what you were getting into with that. But, just if it's something that, doesn't sit well with your beliefs and you want to refrain from watching this season, I completely understand that. There were definitely some things that, made my skin crawl, now that maybe at the time, with having limited knowledge and, understanding and empathy, that I do now through work that we've all done, throughout the past 20 years, I turned a blind eye to it then, and I don't like doing that now. But again, if you're able to detach and just watch it for what it is, you are gonna find a lot of rewarding stuff throughout these matches and throughout these videos, especially if you watch along on your own end. Almost all of this stuff you can find on the WWE Network, of course. Some of the other stuff like fan cams and things like that, if you really want to go on a deep dive, are available on the High Spots Wrestling Network, amongst other places. ECW, really benefited from having licensed music. So if you watch it on the WWE Network or on Peacock, I guess, you lose all of that. That said, I'm not going to link to it or promote it, but you are able to find home brews that people have done, putting back in the original music and all of that stuff. If you look for it on the internet, that is definitely the way to watch these shows in their original forms. It's just such a better immersive experience. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss a video in our countdown, please subscribe to the channel here on YouTube. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Wrestling50, and you can join me tomorrow as we officially begin our countdown of pro wrestling's top 50. Top 50.